morning. We are on Mem Tes Amud Aleph, the bottom, the Mishnah. So yesterday we gave some historic background, and the judge sent me a timely article that was published yesterday, which draw parallels between the history we studied yesterday and today's day. And the overall point is, which is kind of what we were alluding to yesterday, that when Jews fight, the winner is always someone else, our common enemy. So as we read yesterday, we had Hyrcanus and Aspasianus, the brothers of the Hasmonean line, sons of Shlom Tzion Amalka. When they fought, the winner is the common enemy, the Romans, really. And drawing parallels to today's time, when there's a rift amongst the Jewish people, the winner is never the Jews, unfortunately. And we'd be wise to remember that. Especially if you think you're right. This is a common issue, especially when it comes to political life, that our certainty of being right clouds our moral judgment and our obligation to the way we treat our fellow. Considering that we are so convinced that we are right, let's assume we are for a second, and everybody else is wrong, or the other guy's wrong, and this other guy is destroying the world, and to save the world, I'm going to destroy the other guy. It's a big mistake. The manner in which you carry your opinion is equally important to the opinion you hold, if not more important. So if you hold the right opinion incorrectly, it's almost as detrimental as having the wrong opinion. Because when there's Jews infighting, we never win, even if I happen to be right in my side of the infighting, which is why the sages, during this whole tumultuous period, were called the Perushim, or in English, the Pharisees. The word Perushim comes from the word Parush, which means to separate themselves. Because during all this infighting, the sages said, you guys do you think, we're going to go out there and learn Torah. Yes, they did. They at one point, they even moved the Sanhedrin out of the temple. The temple still stood, but they left Jerusalem because of the corruption. A little bit after the story we read yesterday. They just left the temple and went to Yavne and to the Galilee and to other areas to preserve Torah. And they became spiritual leaders, even though they were not political ones, because the political was all corrupted. And said, we're not taking a side, we're just walking from the whole fight. And we are starting Talmud thanks to that. Quite literally. Not figurative speech, quite literally. It's their decision to remove themselves from the political infighting and focus on what they know is correct and true, instead of trying to prove their point on which political party is correct. It's what led to the writing of the Mishnah, the Gemara, and us sitting here today. Quite directly. Anyway, so lots of lessons to be learned from that. Okay, so all that history was really to give background to the Mishnah we're about to read, which reads as follows. So you can see at the bottom of the page, it's the first wide set of lines, the third word, big bold letters, Mem Taf Nun Yud, which stands for Matnisan, which means our Mishnah. Second line of the wider set of lines at the bottom, Mem Tes Aleph 49a. There you have it. Yeah, so it should say Mem Tes with a dot.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Matnisan, our Mishnah reads, Bapolmos Shel Aspasianos. At the war of Aspasianos, who is Vespasian. Vespasian is the emperor that finally destroys the temple. So you have, let me get the order right. Let me see if I get it right. You have Pompey, Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Nero, and then Vespasian. Did I get it right? I think I missed one. Did I miss one? No, I got it right, yeah? So Vespasian is the one that finally destroys the temple, which is, as we're actually going to see, 52 years after the infighting between the two brothers. 52 years, that's what Rashi says. So at the war of Vespasian, which is the war that led to the destruction, Gazru, the sages decreed, alataris chasanin, forbidding the crowns of the bridegrooms of the chassan, the bridegroom. The Gemara is going to explain what that is. So in celebration, they would wear a crown, and since the destruction, they kind of subdued celebration, and they removed the crown from the proceeders. Likewise, balairos and on the drums. There was the drums that would accompany, which we'll learn about in the Gemara. And they they forbade that as well. Again, in subduing our joy, considering the destruction of the temple. We kind of do this with breaking the glass. The breaking of the glass is a spin-off of all of this, which is really a way of us declaring that notwithstanding our joy is incomplete, considering that we don't have a temple, we don't have a homeland, we don't have the Davidic line, we don't have a true Jewish independence, and so on. So that's the breaking of the glass business, which is kind of a spin-off of this thing, and subduing our joy, or at least infusing our joy with recognition that it's incomplete so long as our entire people are not at home under Torah rule in Israel. Okay, so this is the War of Aspasianos. Now, backing up 52 years earlier, the Pomos Shel Titus in the War of Titus. Now, Titus is not an emperor, but was I think a proconsul or a procurator, whatever they called it, basically a regional governor for Rome. That was Titus. And he was the one who was invited by Aspasianus, the brother, to fight Hyrcanus, the other brother. So during that infighting, 52 years before Vespasian, that's what Rashi tells us. Let me see that Rashi again. Just scrolling up. Yeah, Titus was brought in by Hyrcanus. I'm sorry, not Aspasianus. Hyrcanus was brought. Invited Titus to fight his brother Aristobulus. Those are the right names. Sorry. And between these 2 years was 52 years between these two events. So the Civil War is 52 years before the final invasion of Rome by Vespasian, or the destruction. I shouldn't say invasion because Rome were already there before. Right. And in between those 52 years is when you have Agrippa, the king we had earlier with the whole Hakel business. Right. The two brothers after the fallout, right, we read that Pompey favored the older, weaker brother, Hyrcanus, which was then replaced by his advisor, Antipater, who was from Edomites, and it was his son, Herod, who became the king after him, and then after him, Agrippa. So that's all in that span of 52 years between the Civil War and the destruction by Vespasian.
So the ally for Hyrcanus,
Titus,
was prior to this new ally with.
No. Well, Pompey himself didn't necessarily go.
Oh, he didn't necessarily go.
Okay. I'm assuming he sent Titus.
Oh, okay.
That was I think that's correct. Because Titus is right. Pompey's office is in Damascus. Right, it was in Syria. And my understanding was that he sent Titus as a proconsul or procurator, whatever they called it, whatever they called that office, governor of Judea, basically. Sorry, yeah. And he was the one who backed Hyrcanus against Aristobulus. So during that civil war, Gazru, they decreed alatares kalos, on the decreed forbidding the crowns of the brides, the brides. So 52, first they banished the brides because that was the first level of subduing the celebration because of the Civil War, and then by the destruction of Vespasian, they banished the groom's crown also, and then the drums. And likewise, Adam as Benoy Yavanis. And they also banned anyone from teaching their children Greek. And we're going to see that's related to the story that we read about the guy who spoke Greek and explained to the Romans that by giving them the daily offering, he was actually supporting them, and then he put a pig in there. Right, that was that story. So related to that is this decree. Now the Gemara says, at the final war or the final rebellion. Now, which final rebellion is it talking about? So Rashi says this is referring to the destruction of the temple, which was also by Titus. That's how Rashi puts it. Now,
not Vespasian,
right? Which is a little bit interesting, I suppose, because we had Aspasianos as Vespasian. Yeah. So I'm not really sure how that plays out, unless Vespasian is the emperor and Titus is the proconsul that actually implements it.
Yeah,
it's possible.
Like an officer.
An officer of Vespasian. Yeah. But what's interesting though is that the Gemara first refers to it as the Pomos Shel Aspasianos and then the Pomos Acher. First it calls it the War of Vespasian, and then it says the war of the last war. So why would it give two different titles for the same war? Right? So, which is why I assume that is the reason why Rabbi Steinsaltz translates this last war as the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is years after the destruction. Which would mean we're talking about three different wars here, which is why it's given three different titles. One's Vespasian, one is a civil war, and one is the final war of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. But Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi said it's talking about the destruction of the temple under Titus. Yeah. Let's see if the article gives us any more insight. Imagine they would. Let's see. It's probably there, but it's in the other room. No. It's not a question of history. It's a question of which war the Mishnah is referring to. Let's see. They translate the first war during Vespasian's campaign against Jerusalem. And then the final war, they write during Titus's campaign. And then for the last war, they translate it as during the final campaign, without saying what. So let's see 58 in the footnote. This campaign which concluded the destruction of the temple. This campaign as well led by Titus. Rashi, who apparently regards the aforementioned Titus campaign as an earlier event distinct from the final siege and capture of Jerusalem. So Rashi differentiates between two different stages in Titus's invasion. Alternatively, the siege and collapse of Betar, when Hadrian suppressed the Jewish revolt led by Bar Kokhba. That's Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation. Some 65 years after destruction. According to this interpretation, the parallel between the Mishnah is complete. Vespasian, Titus, Bar Kokhba. That's the way Steinsaltz translates it, and the way they translate it here based on other current interpreters as well. Yeah, as opposed to the Rashi's interpretation, which gives us two different campaigns of Titus. Sorry, what did you say?
The Bar Kokhba revolt was how many years after the destruction?
65 years, it says here. Some 65 years. Right. Vespasian famously became emperor. Nero died while he was on a campaign in. Right, now it's coming back to me. He was in Jerusalem, and that's when he found out Nero died. He became emperor, left to go back to Rome, and left Titus to finish the job. That's the story. Now I'm remembering. All right. There's a whole bunch of discussion exactly how they interpret Rashi. Clearly, they have the same struggle with Rashi that I was presenting. Yeah. So that's why they separate between Titus and Vespasian, because Vespasian actually left. Right. Vespasian left the battlefield and left his son Titus in command of the legion surrounding Jerusalem. Okay. Okay, so we had at the Vespasian War, they banished the grooms' crowns and the drums. Earlier, at the civil war between the brothers, which is when they invited Titus, they banned the crowns of the brides and that no one should teach their children Greek. And during the last rebellion, the last struggle, whatever the last struggle is, let's just go with Bar Kokhba, they decreed that the kala should not go in what's called I looked this up, palanquin throughout the city. It's like those little boxes. It's little like I think it's like a box that you sit inside of and you get carried by your servants. And they decorate it. I think it still exists in like the Far East. We like have like people carry around in the back.
I've seen it at a wedding.
Yeah, so it's kind of like they do it at the hennas.
Yeah,
It's kind of like the henna, yeah. So that's right. So they banished that custom of carrying the bride through the streets in this palanquin, I think it's called. Did I get the word right? I think it's the right word. And they banished that. But Rabbi Seinu, our sages, presumably the sages of the Mishnah, which is sometime after, a little after Bar Kokhba, and certainly after the destruction of the temple, which is even earlier, Hitiru should take to a kala by Frayim B'Seicha Ir. They allowed the kala to go in this cage because of modesty. So initially, the carrying on the shoulders in this box is a way of celebration, carrying it through the streets with great fanfare. It's all pretty. So they banished it to subdue the celebration. But instead, she ended up walking down the street alone, and now everybody's gawking at her. So they decided, for the sake of modesty, they'll let her go back into that cage and be carried there. What do you want to say?
Who's banishing this?
The sages. The sages are making these decrees considering the destruction.
So the sages also banished teaching Greek to your kids?
Yes. Yeah.
So we were teaching Greek to the kids before?
Israel was very Greekified at the time. It was Roman, but I mentioned this before, the Romans didn't really care for culture. They just cared for the check.
Okay.
So the Jews still maintained a lot of the Greek culture, which is only a couple decades earlier under the Hasmoneans.
And the sages started.
Or actually before the Hasmoneans, when the Greeks under Alexander's invasion, or not invasion, his takeover, peaceful takeover somewhat. Sorry, what did you say?
I'm saying, okay, and then
yes.
The sages started banning.
Yeah, so that's correct. Israel was full of Greek at the time. So again, Caesarea is a classic example of that. But Caesarea is built later by Herod under Roman thinking, but it's still built on like the Greco culture, that kind of architecture and that kind of the amphitheaters and all that kind of thing. Okay, now the Mishnah goes on to describe the last of the sages of the Mishnah, the Mishnaic era. It's mostly the sages of the generation that's the last generation of destruction and the first generation post-destruction. So a lot of the names here are Bar Kokhba's time, or during the destruction, or somewhere around there, during that transitional era, which is the predominant speakers in the Mishnah. The predominant speakers in the Mishnah is this generation we're about to describe. And the Mishnah goes on to describe each sage, what quality they embodied, and that when they died, that quality no longer exists in the world on the level that it was when they were here. So as follows. Mishim Meshav Meir. When their mayor died, when he passed, Batlu Moshe Mishalim. We no longer have those who can give us proper parables. The mayor had this unique quality there's one thing to be able to understand deep concept. A much deeper and much more fierce quality is the ability to be able to give parables to those deep ideas. Some phone buzzing. Yeah. Okay, no worries. And beyond being able to understand deep quality, one of the great there's a virtue in being able to package those deep ideas into simple language so that anybody can understand. The same idea is said about Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, that he was he was able to say 3,000 parables. The Mishnah says that maybe he was able to do 30 parables. So for every idea he would explain, he had 30 different analogies to explain it. So he had this deep capacity to simplify things. And in general, when you can simplify something, it's because you have a deep understanding of it. When you have a vague understanding of something, it's very difficult to succinctly describe it. When you have a good grasp on something, that's when you can succinctly describe it. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Rabbi Meir is capable of giving analogy is not just a question of, poetic ability to be able to package ideas into words, but also means he has a very good grasp on deep ideas that he can package in simple language. That was Rabbi Meir's quality. Mishim Meis Ben Azai, when Ben Azai passed, Batlu Hashakdonim. We no longer have people who truly, what they say in Yiddish, steig, people who really are diligent and full-time, unstopped learners. And Azai is the famous one who didn't want to marry because he said, Nafshi choshka b'Torah, my soul desires Torah. Right? That's why he didn't want to get married. He ended up marrying Rabbi Akiva's daughter, actually. And he was the one, we had occasion to talk about him once. He was one of the 4 students who entered with Rabbi Akiva into some spiritual realm called the paradise and didn't come out because he just was consumed in the great glory of this mystical experience. So he didn't come out. So he was this intense, devoted learner, person of study. It's in halacha actually mentioned that a person is obligated to get married unless he happens to have this intense love of Torah equal to Ben Azai, which is basically nobody. That's the point the Mishnah is trying to make. Once he died, we no longer have that kind of level of dedication to learning. Misha Meis Ben Zoma, when Ben Zoma passed away, Batal Hadarshan, we no longer have those who have the ability to truly expound and extract meaning from Torah. Rashi points to the famous teaching in the Haggadah, where Elazar ben Azariah says, I never knew that one is required to remember the Exodus at nighttime until Ben Zoma came along and extracted the teaching. Because Ben Zoma had this unique quality to be able to extract teaching from text. And when he died, it's no longer. Mishmesh Rabbi Akiva, when Rabbi Akiva passed away, Batal Kavod Torah. The honor and glory of Torah is no longer since Rabbi Akiva passed away. Rabbi Akiva, who we also had occasion to talk about once here, he was the one that knew how to derive law from every single letter, word in Torah, even koitzai, even like the little straw, even the keser, even the crowns on the letters, he would derive teaching from. So that's a true honor of Torah, where no word and no letter, no syllable is extra. And Rabbi Akiva had that unique ability to ascribe to Torah this divine power that, which if it's divine, then every single detail is absolutely relevant. And Rabbi Akiva had that quality. When Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa passed away, Batul Anshe Maisa. We no longer have men of action, people who could really get things done. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is famous as a miracle worker. He's the one who famously said his daughter was once crying because they had no oil in the house and she couldn't light her Shabbos candles. She would use vinegar.
Or vinegar.
Yeah, and he said, let the one who said that oil should burn, let him say that vinegar should burn. Right? This is like manipulating creation. Hashem invested in creation energy for oil to burn and not in vinegar. And Rabbi Chanina says, well, we're going to rearrange the order and the energy that Hashem has for oil to burn, we'll redirect it into vinegar and let the vinegar burn. So this is Anshe Maisa, men of action, men who have like full control of creation. It's not on this level. All these things exist as we're learning the Gemara, but not on the same level as the Mishnah. So it doesn't mean that they don't exist anymore. It's not as if there's nobody since Ben Azai, people who learn Torah all the time. There are people who learn Torah all the time. There have been in history many people like that. Rabbi himself actually describes his relationship with Torah as a love between, he calls it the love of his youth, describes it as his first woman, referring to Torah, like his primary woman that he loves. He writes it in one of his letters. We mentioned this in Shabbos. But on the level that the Mishnah describes, that doesn't exist ever since these people passed. Likewise, Mishemei Rabbi Yossi Katanta, when Rabbi Yossi, the small one, passed, Paskul Chasidim, we no longer have pious ones. Chasidim, people who go beyond the letter of the law. Which is why, why was he called the small one? Shahaya Katanta Chasidim, because he was the least of all the Chasidim. And then when he passed, that's it, there's no more real pious Jews. Likewise, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one who met with Vespasian and the one who informed Vespasian that Nero had died with miraculous intuition. Batal Ziv HaChachma. We no longer have a ray of wisdom. Now Rashi says, interestingly, Ze lo yadayna mahi. I don't know what this is. Rashi says, I don't know what this Ziv HaChachma is. Ziv means a ray, Chachma means wisdom. A ray of wisdom. I don't know what this is, says Rashi. Even though it seems so obvious to me. Yochanan ben Zakkai had the ability to know in Jerusalem that Nero had died in Rome. Is that not a ray of wisdom? But for some reason, Rashi says, I don't know what it is, so I'm not going to presume to know better than Rashi. Now, Mishemeis, Rabbi Gamliel Hazaken, when Rabbi Gamliel the elder, that is the son of Hillel the elder, the first of that line of Nasis, succeeded by his son, Rabbi Gamliel the elder, right? Because it was Hillel, Gamliel, Shimon, Yehuda. So you have Gamliel the elder, You have Hillel the elder, Gamaliel the elder, Shimon the elder. First generation. So Gamaliel the elder, when he passed, batal kavod Torah. The honor of Torah is no longer. Now it's the same wording as Rabbi Akiva, but Rashi explains it differently. With Rabbi Akiva, he describes the honor of Torah as the ability to understand that there's no extra letter in Torah. That's the honor of Torah there. The honor of Torah from Rabbi Gamliel, explains Rashi, is that in his time, people were extremely healthy and strong, and they would learn Torah standing. And ever since he passed away, that strength is a kind of health, that vigor is no longer, and people sit to learn. This is what Rashi tells us. I'm sure there are other interpretations, but I'm giving Rashi's.
This is an aside.
Yeah.
We learned where Rabbi Akiva did not want to interpret the letter Vav, was it, in order to
Right.
make a meaning
Or was it the?
something?
No, yeah, you're right.
Back if you.
Was it the extra hay, maybe?
It was a Vav.
There was an extra letter that he didn't. Interesting point.
So I didn't know.
Interesting point.
I guess it's not only what he attributes to meaning, but maybe what
The way he does it also.
doesn't attribute meaning.
That's also possible. The way Rashi puts it is, where's the Rashi there? Yeah. That he would pay attention to every single extra crown on top of the letter, or every stroke on top of the letter, and how much more so every single letter.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives an example. Anyway, okay. It's the point to go back there and look at that. Okay, the Gemara continues with respect to Rabbi Gamliel's, the elders passing. So there's no longer the honor of Torah. People no longer stand when they learn, they're now sitting. The Mishnah continues, Umesa Tara uprecious. And with him died purity, and precious means asceticism. That's what precious means, to be separated, to be removed, to be detached from materialistic pleasure. Now, parenthetically, I should tell you that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi says about himself, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is the great-great-grandson of Gamliel, the elder, right? Hillel, Gamliel, Shimon, Yehuda, the compiler of the Mishnah. He says about himself that Miyomai, before he passed, he vowed that he never enjoyed of this world. He never enjoyed of this world. Dalta quotes this in Tanya. And even though Rabbi Yehuda was very wealthy and had a lot going on in his elsewhere in the Gemara where it describes how he ate well, considering his wealth, he had a certain food that wasn't available. He used to have it in abundance.
It was vegetables, right?
A certain vegetable, that's right. A certain vegetable that wasn't available, he had it in abundance because of his wealth. But nonetheless, all that eating was never for I enjoy. It was always in the service of Hashem, right? But that's not pernicious. That's not what we're describing here as asceticism. Pernicious means I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm not going to eat it. Not even for the sake of Hashem. Just not going to eat it. Unless all I eat is black bread. Sorry?
It's just punishment, right?
It's self-negation. It's complete self-negation. All I eat is black bread and salt. The Mishnah says a person should eat bread and salt and measured water and sit on the floor and study Torah. It's asceticism. Completely detach oneself from the world. That's precious, as opposed to the model of Rabbi Yehuda, which is lots of wealth, but all that wealth redirected for the service of Hashem. Which, if we had to classify the difference between the way the post-war Jews in the West serve Hashem versus the pre-war Jews of the East, that would be the distinction. In the pre-war model, the way to attach to Hashem was to live in a village, to separate far. The closer you got to the bigger cities, the less Jewishly engaged people were. Warsaw was the less of the religious towns or cities from throughout Poland. And the same thing was true with other countries where the big cities were less observant. The small towns, that's where the observant Jews were completely detached and removed from the world, living on almost nothing. But the post-war American Jew, or the Westerner Jew, is do well, have a successful business, and give lots of tzedakah, and serve Hashem in that way. It's the Rabbi Gamliel the elder versus Rabbi Yehuda model, maybe. Finally, two more of these sort of statements. Misha Mace, Rabbi Shmuel ben Pavi, and Rabbi Shmuel son of Pavi passed. He was a kohen. Botla ziv hakuna. The ray of what it's like to be a kohen passed. Ziv, the ray, the shine. Specifically, explains Rashi, he was both wise and wealthy, and therefore, as a wise and wealthy person with access to lots of kohanic treats, he would open his home to all of the other kohanim to come and eat with him. And that's the shine of the kohen, not just to be a kohen, but to be the kind that's capable of sharing his kohanic level with fellow kohens, considering his wisdom and wealth. And finally, Mishemesh Rebbe, once the Rebbe passed away, batal anava v'yiras. Humility and fear of sin is no longer. This Rebbe that we described earlier, who was very wealthy and ate everything only in the service of Hashem, he was the one who was truly humble and truly fear of sin. And perhaps that even ties in. A person who lives like Rabbi Gamliel, ascetic, fear of sin, he technically can't sin because he can't afford to sin. It's someone who's wealthy, who can very well afford to sin, but doesn't because he has the fear of sin. That's fear of sin. One who doesn't want to sin because how can I sin?
It's much easier to sin in the city than in the
exactly. So Rabbi Yehuda, who's very wealthy, has a much easier time sinning, so to speak, than say Rabbi Gamliel, who's living asceticism. Maybe just perhaps connected. So it's a certain humility, and it gets back to the point also. Humility, as we're going to learn, God willing, when we get to the Gemara's analysis of the statement, we'll learn more. Humility is not that a person doesn't know what he has. Humility is a person knows what he has and has the humility to know that it's a gift from Hashem. A person who doesn't know what he has is not humble. He's just a liar. It's just not true. It's fooling oneself. Humility is to know what one has, whatever the person has, whether it's wealth or intelligence or whatever the person has been granted, but to acknowledge it's a gift from Hashem. And that's Rabbi Yehuda's model. He has all this wealth, but he never enjoyed this world. It's not about him. And his humility, it's all a gift from Hashem. And that's true fear of sin. Not I have no ability to sin, and that's why I don't sin. But it's the fear of sin, right? It's like this whole discussion about like the elders versus the youngers. The elders don't sin. What, because they don't want to anymore? Because they just can't. And the younger ones, I'm referring to the one and only sin. The sin of youth, as they call it. A young man who doesn't sin, that's true fear of sin. So likewise with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who had a wealthy and opulent life, but nonetheless refrained from sin out of his humility and knowing that's all a gift from Hashem. We're going to learn more about that when we get to the Gemara's analysis. But I'll conclude with this is a famous episode in Chabad, Purim 1950. It was 1956. Maybe it's 57 already because it's after January. Yeah, Purim 1957. The Rabbi spoke about this idea that of generations past, the challenge was poverty. But now the challenge is wealth. Serving Hashem under poverty is one challenge, but serving Hashem when you have wealth is another challenge. And the challenge of our generation is a challenge of wealth. And he went on to elaborate on the unique challenge of wealth. And that this is the challenge of our generation and so on. It's in some ways more difficult than the challenge of being poor, having everything available to you and still saying no. And then he concluded by saying, anyone who wants to be rich and feels they can handle the challenge of being wealthy should please raise their right hand. And you can hear the audio, the crowd laughs. They think it's a joke. Because he just finished saying how difficult it is to be wealthy. Now he's been announced, so it's not a joke. And then repeats himself and he says, I'm telling you, I'm going to get letters from you tomorrow asking me for blessings for wealth. And you're going to tell me I didn't realize by the gathering that you meant it. And I'm telling you now, I mean this. If you really ready to take on the challenge of being wealthy, please raise your right hand. And only a handful of people did, and all of them died multimillionaires. All of these people who raised their hand, most did not. And he said, "Oh, you guys are being chabatzke shtick. Chabatzke shtick is like, you're playing false humility here. You don't want to publicly raise your hand that you want to be rich. But tomorrow you're going to write me a letter saying, please bless me." There says, don't do that. Now is an opportunity. Raise your hand. There's a video years later, someone coming to the Rebbe and saying that I heard about this incident. Can I raise my hand now? And the Rebbe said, I'm sorry. It was a one-time thing that existed then. But all to say this idea of fear of sin and humility, especially when one is wealthy, when one has, acknowledging the blessings, acknowledging that it is a blessing with humility, and that way refraining from misbehaving, not just because you can't, but because you understand it's inappropriate. Okay, so we'll get more on this when we get to the Gemara's analysis of this statement. Have a good day, Yidden.
Thank you.